And the first chapter that Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala mentions is Babul Mawaqit, the chapter regarding, or the section regarding the times of the prayers. The times of the prayers. When is Fajr to be prayed, from when and when? When does Dhuhr start? When does it end? When does Asr start? When does it end? Etc. What are the times for the prayers? When is it permissible to start praying a particular prayer? And when is it ending? When is the ending time for that prayer? So al-mawaqit jam'u miqat wa huwa al-hadd al-muhaddad. Mawaqit, this word in the Arabic language, it comes from miqat, and that means to make the boundary of something. To make the boundaries of something. And the boundaries of something can be two types. They can either be geographical, physical boundaries, like for example in Hajj, there are the mawaqit. When you have to make Hajj, then you make the ihram from certain geographical locations that are mentioned. So that is mawaqit, geographical boundaries. Or it can be boundaries that are not geographical and physical, but they are linked to time zones and time boundaries. So here the mawaqit are referring to the times, not the geographical physical type. So here now, the times of those boundaries are going to be mentioned. And that is just like Allah said in the Quran, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتْ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا. That indeed this prayer, it is upon the believers an allotted time and a fixed prescribed time. Meaning that you must then perform those prayers in those times for them to be correct and accurate. So then, we come to the first hadith regarding the times of the prayers. The hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr radiyallahu anhuma. أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: وقت الظهر إذا زالت الشمس وكان ظل الرجل كطوله ما لم يحضر العصر ووقت العصر ما لم تصفر الشمس ووقت المغرب ما لم يغب الشفق ووقت صلاة العشاء إلى نصف الليل الأوسط ووقت صلاة الصبح من طلوع الفجر ما لم تطلع الشمس. رواه مسلم. وله من حديث بريدة في العصر والشمس بيضاء نقية ومن حديث أبي موسى والشمس مرتفعة. So in this hadith now, or these three ahadith with the various narrations, the times for the 5 prayers are all mentioned within this hadith. Firstly then, the Prophet ﷺ starts by mentioning the time for the Dhuhr prayer. And he ﷺ said the Dhuhr prayer starts وقت الظهر إذا زالت الشمس. يعني يدخل وقت الظهر بزوال الشمس عن وسط السماء. فإذا كانت فوق الرؤوس وانحسر الظل فهذا يقال له قيام الشمس. وهذا الوقت لا تحل الصلاة فيه سواء كانت نافلة أو غير النافلة ولا جنازة ولا غيرها. والزوال وقت قصير فإذا زالت الشمس يعني مالت إلى جهة الغرب بأن زالت عن الرؤوس إلى جهة الغرب وبدأ شيء من الظل في جهة الشرق دخل وقت الظهر وهو ما يسمى بدلوك الشمس كما قال تعالى وأقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس. So the Shaykh now explains the Dhuhr prayer, it begins if the sun, it moves from the meridian or the zenith, the middle of the sky. When the sun is at its peak, right above the heads of the people. It's right above, directly above your head in the middle of the sky. When it moves away from the middle of the sky, it moves slightly away from the very middle of the sky. It moves away from that, meaning it starts to go down into which direction?
Downwards.
Which direction? East or west? If it goes to the middle of the day and it starts moving down, where is it going?
No, west.
West. Because it's now sinking. And it's going to go sunset. So if it's gone to the middle of the day, it came from the east. It came from the east and it went to the middle of the day. Right at the heads of the people. Then it starts to move across. When it starts to move across now, it's going to the west. Which means your shadow is going to start coming on
the left side.
Your east side. The shadow will now start to begin on a person on his east side. Because the sun is now moved to the west side. As soon as the sun moves from the middle of the day to the westerly side, and the shadow starts to appear on your easterly side, that's the beginning of the time for dhuhr. That's the beginning for the time of dhuhr. Whereas if the sun is directly above, the time hasn't started yet. The sun needs to move slightly to the west. Your shadow starts to appear from the east. That is the time for dhuhr, which has begun now. And it continues, from that point, it continues, وَكَانَ ظِلُّ الرَّجُلِ كَطُولِهِ, up until the shadow of a person is equal to the size of the person, or the shadow of the object is equal to the size of the object. So as soon as the sun moves to the west, the shadow starts appearing on the east. It's only going to be small to start with. But as the sun goes further and further to the west, the shadow becomes longer and longer. When the shadow gets to the length equal to yourself, or any object you put it down and the shadow is equal to the length of the object, then that's when the time for dhuhr then ends. وَكَانَ ظِلُّ الرَّجُلِ كَطُولِهِ. Shaykh Fawzan says, وَيَسْتَمِرُّ وَقْتُ الظُّهْرِ مِنْ زَوَالِ الشَّمْسِ إِلَىٰ أَنْ يَتَسَاوَى الظِّلُّ مَعَ الشَّاخِصِ حِينَئِذٍ يَنْتَهِي وَقْتُ الظُّهْرِ فإذا صار ظلال العمود بمقدار العمود وظلال الإنسان بمقدار طول الإنسان وظلال العود بمقدار طول العود وظلال الجدار بمقدار طول الجدار فهنا يكون قد انتهى وقت الظهر. So the Shaykh says, when the shadow is equal to the pillar, or the shadow is equal to the stick or to the person or whatever the object is, when the shadow is equal to it, the time for dhuhr has ended. So the Shaykh says, إذا أردت أن تعرف وقت الظهر, if you want to know the time for dhuhr, then all you need to do is فَرْكُزْ عُودًا وَلَوْ كَانَ قَصِيرًا ثُمَّ انظُرْ ذِلَّهِ. He says, if you want to know if dhuhr is still there, and you can still pray, it's still within the time of dhuhr or not, he says all you need to do is take something small, a small stick or whatever it might be, even if it's really small, a couple of centimeters, a few centimeters, stick it into the ground and see if the shadow is equal to that 3 or 4 centimeters object, whatever it is. If it's equal, the time for dhuhr has now ended. Then it says after that, ما لم يحضر العصر ووقت العصر ما لم تصفر الشمس. That therefore now means that as soon as the sun goes from the middle of the day to the westerly side and the shadow starts appearing on the easterly side, the time for dhuhr has started. Up until that shadow gets longer and longer to the equal size of the object, dhuhr ends. When dhuhr ends at that point, the next stage is that the shadow is now going to start becoming ever so slightly bigger than the object. As soon as that happens, the shadow is now just beyond the equal size. It's gone past that now. The time for asr has begun. So the time for dhuhr then ends when the shadow is equal to its length. And after that point, asr then begins. ووقت العصر يبدأ من مساواة الظل للشاخص إلى اصفرار الشمس. So the time for asr, it begins when the shadow is equal. Dhuhr has finished and asr then begins at that stage. And it continues up until the yellowing of the sun. This is what many of the scholars they say. It doesn't end at the time of Maghrib. It ends before the time of Maghrib. And we'll come to the point what the scholars mention regarding that. So here the hadith says, مَا لَمْ تَصْفَرَّ الشَّمْسِ, that asr continues as long as the sun doesn't become yellow. Meaning of that is, when the sun sets, prior to the sun setting, just before it sets, on a clear day, obviously in this country it's difficult, but just before it sets, you see a yellow a yellow haziness. The sun becomes this yellowy, hazy color. The hadith says, before that occurs, this yellow haziness of the sun, the yellowy color of the sun, prior to that Asr is in. When it comes to that type of color, and you see it on a clear day when the sun is setting, how bright and radiant that yellowness, etc. is, then when that occurs, the time for Asr, it ends. ووقت العصر يبدأ نعم لأنها إذا دنت نعم إذا تغير لون الشمس من البياض إلى الصفرة لأنها إذا دنت من الأفق يعلوها الصفرة وكدر من الغبار. So when the shadow is equal to the shape, the Asr begins, the Dhuhr has ended. It continues up until the sun becomes a yellowy color. When you look at the sun when it's directly in the sky, at Dhuhr time or after Dhuhr time, when you look at the sun with glasses or whatever, with shades, it's a very bright color. That's why it's difficult to look at. It's very bright and white. It's a shiny color, white, and it's hard to look at with your eyes. You need glasses, sunglasses, etc. But at the time of sunset, you can look at the sun directly. Over the hills, you can look at the sun without sunglasses, because now the color has changed. It's become this yellowy color. When it becomes that yellowy color, that's what the Shaykh is saying, the time for Asr ends. Even if it hasn't sunk yet, Maghrib hasn't started yet, but it's gone in that yellowy color, Asr is finished. Some scholars say though, they give a different ruling. They say Asr ends when the shadow of an object is twice the size of the object. When the shadow of an object is twice the size of the object, they say that's when Asr ends. وَقِيلَ يَسْتَمِرُّ وَقْتُ الْعَصْرِ إِلَىٰ أَنْ يَصِيرَ ظِلُّ شَيْءٍ مِثْلَيْهِ. That the Asr time, it ends when the shadow of an object is twice the size of the object itself. إِذَنْ فَإِنَّ نِهَايَةَ وَقْتِ الْعَصْرِ لَهُ عَلَامَتَانِ. And in reality, there isn't a contradiction between those two. It's just two different ways of working out when Asr has ended. Look at the sun, if it's that yellowy color, time for Asr has ended. If that's not possible, look at the shadow. If it's twice the size of the object, twice the length of yourself, then the time for Asr has ended. واختلف العلماء فيما بعد اصفرار الشمس إلى مغيب الشمس. هل هو من وقت العصر أو هو خارج عن وقت العصر? Then we have the issue, when the sun goes to the yellowy color, or your shadow is now twice the size of the object, the sun still hasn't set, it's still there. There's still a bit of time left before it sets. That bit of time which is left for the sun to set, from the yellowiness time to when the sun sets, are you allowed to pray Asr in that time or not? Here many of the scholars, like we said in the hadith says up until it goes yellow. After that, finished. That's what the hadith says. But the scholars have mentioned the issue regarding that time period from the time of the sun going yellow, which is almost near sunset, but there's some time left still. That time which is left, the scholars, they differed about it. The first opinion is أنه من وقت العصر. Some of the scholars say it is from the time of Asr still. You can still pray Asr in that time. However, they say this is the waqtu durura. This is the time of necessity. The scholars, they say that time from the yellowiness to the sunset is a time of necessity. Whereas from the shadow being equal to its object up until the yellowiness is the time of preference. That's when you should pray your Asr. That's the preferred, the proper time for Asr. If for some reason, whatever occurs, then that yellowiness to sunset, which is technically not from the time of Asr, as it's mentioned in these hadith, some of the scholars say actually it is okay, but only in necessity. As a means of necessity to pray in that time. فهذا يدل على أن وقتها يستمر إلى الغروب. What indicates that? They have a hadith which says من أدرك ركعة من العصر قبل أن تغرب الشمس فقد أدرك العصر. There's a hadith in Bukhari and Muslim. Because normally now you would think, how can they come to this opinion? The hadith clearly says ما لم تصفر الشمس, Hadith in Sahih Muslim. Asr continues as long as the sun doesn't go yellow. So how could they say that even after it goes yellow to sunset, you can still pray Asr? Although they say it's necessity though. How could they even say that then, if the hadith says only till the yellowiness? Because there is another hadith. There is another narration in Bukhari and in Muslim, where the hadith says that whoever catches one raka'ah of Asr before sunset, then he has caught the Asr prayer. Whoever catches one raka'ah of Asr before the sunset, not before the yellowiness, before the sunset, then he has caught the Asr prayer. So that indicates you can still pray Asr up until sunset. So that's how they combined these evidences, and they said, therefore, the proper time is up until the yellowiness. But the necessity, if there was the necessity, is up until the sunset. That you could still pray and the prayer is still correct and your Asr is still acceptable. That's what they mentioned. And that is only for somebody who has a reasoning. If you have some reason, some necessity, then you could go beyond that time and pray at the very last moments before Maghrib. Otherwise, pray prior to that up until the yellowing of the sun. Then after that, the Prophet ﷺ said, وَوَقْتُ الْمَغْرِبِ مَا لَمْ يَغِبِ الشَّفَقِ وَوَقْتُ الْمَغْرِبِ إِلَىٰ أَنْ يَغِيبَ الشَّفَقِ فَيَبْدَأُ مِنْ غُرُوبِ الشَّمْسِ. The time for Maghrib, it begins with the sunset. The Maghrib time, it begins with the sunset. When the sun disappears, completely disappears. The scholars, they say the sun must completely disappear. Meaning even if you were on some flat land and the sun disappeared, but if you were to climb up a hillside, you could still see it, Maghrib hasn't started. They say it needs to be completely disappeared. Even if you climb up and you look and you can't see it. Completely gone. It's sunk. Sunset. So that sunset is the beginning of the Maghrib time. And it continues إِلَى مَغِيبِ الشَّفَقِ. It continues up until the horizon disappears. But which horizon? Ash-shafaq, shafaqan. There are two of these horizons. One is white and one is red. والجواب إن المراد بذلك الشفق الأحمر وليس الشفق الأبيض. وسيأتي في الحديث أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فسره بالشفق الأحمر. After sunset, you have the remainder of the sunlight still across the horizon. After sunset, you still see light in the distance, in the horizon in the west, where the sun has gone down. You see the whiteness and the haziness and the light still in the distance, even though the sun has set and Maghrib is in. You see that remaining few sun rays. Those, they still exist. Some of those remaining sun rays that exist after the sun goes down are white. You see a white haziness. You also see a red haziness. The white haziness is not what's meant by the end of the Maghrib time. That white haziness, even if it disappears, the sun sets, you see the white haziness, that disappears, no problem. There will be a red haziness in that direction in the sky also. When that red haziness disappears, the final lights of that redness after the sun has gone down, that disappears, that's when Maghrib ends. That's what the scholars, they say regarding the time for Maghrib. So it begins from sunset, and then after sunset you still have some rays of light, white and red. The white ones may disappear, it's no problem. When the red ones disappear and it goes pitch black, that's the end of Maghrib, and that therefore now means the time of Isha has begun. So the time of the ending of Maghrib is when the light completely disappears, the redness disappears, pitch black. Maghrib has ended, which now means that's the same time when Isha now begins. ثم إذا غاب الشفق الأحمر يبدأ وقت العشاء ويستمر وقت العشاء إلى نصف الليل الأوسط وهو نصف الليل الأول لأن النصف له حدان حد بداية وحد نهاية وحد النهاية يسمى الأوسط. وجاء في حديث آخر أن وقت العشاء يستمر إلى ثلث الليل فهناك إذن حديث يحدد نهاية وقت العشاء بنصف الليل وحديث يحدده بثلث الليل. وبناء على ذلك اختلف العلماء في نهاية وقت العشاء والراجح والله أعلم هو أنه إلى نصف الليل كما في هذا الحديث. The time for Isha begins when the redness disappears and it becomes pitch black. Isha begins. It continues up until the middle of the night, or in one narration, up till the third of the night. Two different narrations, up until the third of the night, or up until the middle of the night. Two different narrations, and Shaykh Fawzan says, Allahu A'lam, but as this hadith indicates, what would seem to be apparent is that it's allowed to go to the half of the night. But there are scholars who mention up to the third of the night. Then, if Isha finishes, let's say up to the latter one, to the half of the night, what about the second half of the night then? From that halfway point, Isha finishes, as the hadith mentions. Some even say the third, but let's take it to the half on that narration. After the half, up until Fajr, is it allowed to pray Isha or not then? After half of the night, up until Fajr, can you pray your Isha in that time or not? Again, the scholars, they differed regarding that time period. That time period in the last half of the night up until Fajr, are you allowed to pray Isha in that or not? Al-Qawl al-Awwal, the first opinion on that is أنه يمتد إلى الفجر ولكنه ينقسم إلى قسمين. It's similar to the previous opinion. They say yes, you can carry on praying Isha all the way up until Fajr time starts. However, there is a time of preference and there's a time of necessity. The time of preference up until half the night, and after that would be a time of necessity. Some scholars, they give this opinion. The second opinion is that the second half of the night, beyond the halfway point, then that is outside of the time of Isha altogether. Even necessity. It's outside the time of Isha. If you pray your Isha then, you technically haven't prayed your Isha in its time. You haven't prayed Isha in its time, and that would be considered as you praying your prayer or making it up after the time has gone. It wouldn't be considered as in the time. Whereas the first opinion says it is in the time out of necessity, so your prayer would still be correct in its time out of necessity. But the second opinion says no, the time is gone. You pray then, pray it, but it's making it up after the time is gone. So that's the two opinions regarding the second half of the night. The final prayer that is left to be mentioned is the Fajr. When does the time for Fajr begin? And when does the time for Fajr end? أما وقت الفجر فإنه يبدأ من طلوع الفجر الثاني المعترض ويستمر إلى طلوع الشمس لأن الفجر فجران. Fajr is two types. You often hear the people saying the false dawn and the true dawn. The false dawn and the true dawn. The false Fajr and the true Fajr. There are two Fajrs. But which one is the time for the Fajr prayer to be prayed and which one is not? Firstly, as the Shaykh says, there is one type of Fajr which is known as the false Fajr. Al-Fajr al-Kadhub. هو الذي يسمى بالفجر الكذوب. The false Fajr. وهو فجر يخرج ممتدا كالعمود في الأفق على شكل عمود أو على شكل عمود. فهذا يسمى الفجر الأول. ثم يأتي بعده ظلمة وهذا لا يعتمد عليه في الصلاة. The night, it's in its pitch black. Then towards the time of sunrise, prior to sunrise by whatever the time, you start to see the light. Initially, the scholars, they say, the fuqaha, they say, the light, when it first starts to appear in the early hours, after the pitch blackness of the night, the first time the light appears, it appears in a vertical manner. You'll see in the horizon the light coming up in a vertical manner, upwards like a column. This light, it comes up and you see it. But after a while, the scholars, they say, the fuqaha, they say, that light disappears and it becomes pitch black again. That light is known as the false Fajr. Because some people in the pitch black, if they start seeing this light coming up now, they think that's it, the sun's about to rise, Fajr time. But actually that is a false Fajr, because that light which comes up in this vertical fashion, upwards like a column, after a while, the scholars, they say, the fuqaha, it disappears. You'll notice that. It disappears after a while, it goes pitch black again. So that is known as the false Fajr. It looks like light is coming out now, but then after a while it disappears and goes black again. That is not the time for the beginning of Fajr. That is the false Fajr. You can continue to eat if you're going to fast. That isn't Fajr. And you can't pray your Fajr prayer yet. The second Fajr, after that light, it comes up in a straight form, vertically, then it disappears. Then the light comes out again. But this time, the scholars, they say, if you notice, it will come out in a horizontal way, spread across the horizon. That light, when it comes out horizontally across the horizon, that's the actual Fajr and the true Fajr. Now the sun is going to come up soon. When the light comes out horizontally across the horizon. Not when it comes out vertically in the first place and then it disappears. When it comes out for the second time horizontally across the horizon, that is the actual time for the Fajr beginning now. Because once that light comes out across the horizon vertically, that's it. After that, it's going to get lighter and lighter. That doesn't disappear. That doesn't disappear, it doesn't get dark again. It only gets lighter and lighter after that. That is the actual Fajr. And that is just like Allah mentioned in the Quran, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ. Eat and drink until the black string, the white string becomes apparent to you from the black string. And the meaning of that is the horizon. The black string, the darkness of night. The white string, the light of Fajr arising. When that becomes apparent, Fajr has now begun. You must stop eating if you are fasting, and the time for Fajr is in. So this is when it is obligatory, the time has started now, and a person can pray his Fajr prayer, and that continues all the way up until sunrise. All the way up until sunrise. As soon as the sun starts to rise, Fajr ends. From the time of the second Fajr, the true Fajr, up until when sun rises, when the sun starts to rise, it appears, that's it, the Fajr time ends. That is the general categorizations of the 5 times of the Fajr prayers. The times for the 5 prayers, that's the general categorization of them.